Welcome in to the Storycraft Cafe. Thanks for joining us today. I am Hank Garner, your host, as always. And today, joining us again, Christopher Paolini, one of my all time favorite authors and someone I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last few years. Christopher has an amazing year that's unraveling as we speak. You've got a brand new book coming out next week, the
Yeah.
second sci-fi epic, the follow-up to Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and it's called Fractal Noise.
hmm
And you kind of surprised all of your um, long-term fantasy fans a while back, and you announced that later this year, Murtaugh, another trip to Alagaësia is coming out.
Yeah.
First off, how are you, Christopher? And thank you for joining us.
I'm good. Thanks for having me back. How many times have we talked now? This is what,
It's
three or four?
three or four, four, I think. But
Four? That sounds about
yeah,
right.
yeah, sounds
Um, yeah, it's been quite the year so far, and continues. I think it's going to continue to be quite the year. So yeah, Murtagh, which I say it my way. I don't say it the Irish way, which is annoys a lot of people. But see, that's how I learned. That's how I came up with all the names and languages in the inheritance cycle. Is I mispronounced things to my own satisfaction as I read other
love it.
people's books, and then just applied those rules to my languages. But I highly recommend readers to do that with my work as well. But yeah, Murtagh comes out November 7th, and also on November 7th, we are releasing the 20th uh, anniversary edition of Aragon, and it is a fully illustrated book, full color, with like 50 some paintings and illustrations throughout. And it's not just a regular size book; it's like a art book. It's
Yeah.
double width. It's got the text is in two columns. Siddharth is the artist, and he's done a bunch of stuff for Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons, and he
So does it
really.
does it feel more like a coffee table book? Is it like
Yes.
that
Yes.
size? Oh, I
Yes.
love it.
It's gorgeous. And Siddharth was a fan of the books himself growing up, so he really poured his heart and soul into the work. And I'm delighted with the result, and can't wait for people to read it. And of course, Murtagh, especially since uh, it's there's a lot in that book. There's a lot in that book.
I can't wait to get my hands on it and to see what you're gonna do to my heart this time. Um,
he has the biggest spoiler I can give you, which probably isn't a spoiler, is that poor Murtagh has a rough time in this book. Which
we
really is to be expected.
well,
No one
yeah,
no one would be happy if he just had sunshine and roses in this book.
love it. 20th anniversary of
Yeah. I mean, it's longer than that for me because I started working on Aragon in 1998, which for you and me doesn't seem that long ago, perhaps,
right.
but it's getting back there now. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a quarter of a century.
Looking back on that time now, and we talked, um I think one of the first times we talked, just about the crazy story that you have of publishing, and how it all came to be, and now looking back with a 20-year vantage point,
Right.
and now seeing your writing not only um encompass the original fantasy series, but now branching out to sci-fi.
Mm.
When you look back on young Christopher, who was endeavoring to write and publish that first book, do you look back and does that even feel like you anymore?
Yes and no. I mean, if I go back and read my old journals, or even chunks of the first book, there are parts of it that I just don't recognize anymore. It's I don't like to reread my work like most
Yeah.
authors. It's not. I do so much of it during the revision process. By the time the book is published, I'm sick of it.
Right.
Um, but also, just the passage of years erases the memory of actually creating some of the work. So sometimes I'll look at it and go, I don't even remember writing this. Hey, this isn't half bad. And then I'll look at it at the next paragraph, and I go, oh, okay, that could use some work. Um, yeah, I think the biggest thing looking back is, my core values and interests have remained the same.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is just my own experience, or just getting older, but I definitely think that some of the um, sparky energy I had has tamped down over the years. And I think, again, part of that is just dealing with life and also getting older.
Yeah.
But I'm a lot more steady in terms of persistence and knowing what I want and knowing how to pursue it. The biggest thing, though, is just uh, I had so much anxiety when I started because my family was in a very uncertain position, and what I was trying to do was really uh, unproven. There was no guarantee that it was going to work. And so there was a
Yeah.
lot of anxiety attached to it. And I look back on it, and I've seen other people say this with their own lives. And it's like worrying about things does you absolutely no good. All it
Yeah.
does is stress you out, doesn't change the outcome. And I wish I could go back and tell my past self, my teenage self, to just stop worrying so much about this. Of course, the flip side is sometimes that anxiety or concern can spur you to do the work that would be too uncomfortable to do otherwise. So I don't want to say that it's, you know, completely useless. Negative motivation can be just as powerful, if not more powerful than positive motivation, but you have to channel it in a constructive manner so you don't tear yourself apart.
Right. Um, most people don't have the publishing story that you did. You begin writing as a
Yeah.
teenager, publish, as a very young adult. Most people are coming to writing, usually 20s, 30s,
hmm
40s, sometimes
I
50s,
think I think
and
the average age of a first time author is like 36,
that
35,
sounds right.
36. Yeah.
That sounds about right. Um, and one thing that we tell ourselves when coming to something later in life, and there's some truth to this, is that well, you needed time to accumulate some life experience because a maturity reflects itself more in
Yeah.
a writer than maybe young naivete. Um, you began publishing at a very young age, and you also started a new sci-fi series at an older age.
Mm.
Does any of that hold true to you?
Yeah.
What do you think
Yeah.
about
I
the
mean,
maturity of the writer?
the biggest disadvantage as a young person writing is your lack of experience. But
Yeah,
the flip side is you can't do anything about that in the moment.
right.
So yeah, I wouldn't worry about it if you're a young writer. Aside from perhaps putting some extra attention into learning the fundamentals, trying to master the tools of the trade, whether, linguistically as far as writing. And I won't say I'm the greatest master in the world, but I've put a lot of work into improving from where I started from. And that's probably the biggest thing. Also, the more stories you attempt to write and sometimes fail at writing, the more, hopefully, if you're paying attention and you're getting some good editing advice, you're going to get tools that will help you be successful in your future stories. And you can go, okay, I know I tried this in the past and it didn't work, so I'm going to avoid that. Or I know it's a potential issue, so I'm going to put some thought into it before I start writing. All of those things have been very helpful. I think what you perhaps don't have when you're older is the fearless energy of youth, because when you're 18, 19, you think you know how the world works, and maybe you
Right.
do know how the world works, but what you don't have a good grasp on is the scale of things, the turn of the years, the interaction between the generations, the patterns that evolve, and just the amount of work and time life takes over decades. And the positive side of that is that I think, especially when I was younger, I was a lot more willing to just jump headfirst into a project with no idea how to do it because, what the heck? I'm going to figure it out as I go along. Now I'll still tackle that project, but I'll put a lot more groundwork into it beforehand. And I think that has been a useful lesson, that the more groundwork I put in before I write something, the less trouble I get myself in down the road.
Yeah. A few years ago, before you published "To Sleep in a Sea of Stars," you had been very vocal about tackling this new project, and
hmm
that it was taking a little while.
Yeah.
Whereas you work on the first fantasy book for a number of years, and it comes out, and then you're under a publishing contract, and there are
Yeah.
deadlines, and the writing speeds up, and you learn as you go, and you become more well equipped, and all of that good stuff. But then switching gears from fantasy to science fiction, was that a completely new world? Like in bookstores, we love to group science fiction and fantasy
Yeah.
together. I'm not exactly sure what that's all about, but we just always have talked about sci-fi and fantasy like they're close cousins.
I mean, they
Um,
are.
are they?
They are. I mean, they're genres of imagination. And one could actually make an argument for throwing horror into there as well. At least horror that has a supernatural element.
Right.
I mean, one could even make an argument for certain techno thrillers really
Sure.
deserving to be in the sci-fi genre as well. But um, when I think of a science fiction like Hyperion or Dune or something where it's creating an entirely new setting, entirely new rules to the universe and the culture, that's very much what fantasy will do in many cases. So they're similar in that respect. I mean, I'm a big sci-fi reader as well as a fantasy reader. So from a fan as a fan, it wasn't
Yeah.
so much of a shift. As a writer, the biggest shift for me was having to shift my vocabulary because I'd spent about over a decade establishing certain patterns that worked really well for fantasy,
Hmm.
and then having to just rejigger my own internal um, computer in terms of deciding how to say things and how to present the information to the
Yeah.
readers. And I really enjoyed that. It was a necessary change after the inheritance cycle, and then coming back to the world of Aragon, what I've been able to do and learned in the science fiction side of things, I think has improved the fantasy writing as well. It just gave me additional tools. But A, the language, and then B, everyone can take a different approach to science fiction. My approach was wanting to have some of the things that are a little more hand wavy, like faster than light travel, but at the same time, not wanting to contradict physics as we know it, which is a tall, tall order. But the reason for that is because the fractal verse, which encompasses To Sleep in a Sea of Stars and Fractal Noise and other books that I'm going to write, is in the real world. So it's just in the future or the past, but it includes the real world. So I had to take everything we know now into account in my fictitious setting. And that's part of the reason why it took so long. And I did a ton of research on that. Uh, so, how to have a FTL system that doesn't contradict physics as we know it, doesn't allow for time travel, and hasn't been used by any other sci-fi franchise. So that one felt like banging my head on a wall for about a year.
Well,
And the thing is, like, it doesn't even appear that much in the stories. It's a means of travel. Most of the characters are not sitting there thinking about the mechanics of this, but the mechanics of it dictate what is and isn't possible, and then that dictates pacing of the story, locations that are available, travel times, all of that.
it's is it a lot like creating a magic system
It's
in a
exactly like
fantasy
that.
world?
Yeah, I mean, because in fantasy, magic tells you what is or isn't possible in your world, and in science fiction, the technology tells you what is or isn't possible. And actually, that's the first thing I'll always look at when I'm creating a new setting, whether it's science fiction or fantasy. Is okay. I have a story idea. Maybe I even have a general plot. Before I put any more attention into that side of things, I'll step back and say, what is physically possible in this setting? Is there anything different from physics as we know it? Is there magic? Is there technology that changes things? Because that has to be taken into account.
Does your plotting slash note taking, building the scaffolding of
Hmm.
the story before you start writing, is that different when you write science fiction versus fantasy?
No,
Or
no, and it's not even different for YA. It's all the same process because I mean, you can tell a good story in a paragraph if you have motivation, if you have a character change, if you have we are storytelling animals. We
Mhm.
naturally tell stories. You can sit around with a bunch of people around a campfire and you will naturally just start telling stories, and when a story works or when it doesn't. So the process is exactly the same. And I'll say this, I've gotten a lot more rigorous with that process because every story that I've written that hasn't worked, and this includes the first couple drafts of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, a couple of screenplays I've written, um, even the first draft of Fractal Noise, has been because I didn't put the groundwork in to understand the story on a really deep structural level. And that's something I did do with the Inheritance cycle, and it saved my bacon more times than I can count as a new writer, having that solid foundation underneath me. It was the hero's journey. It was the traditional, you know, hero's journey, and understanding that and knowing how it fit together really, really helped me. I mean, because when you're starting out, you're having to do everything for the first time:
Right.
characters, description, world building, plotting. And not that there's any real difference between plotting and character, but if you can rely on some elements that work because they've been proven historically, that can free up your mental energy and your uh, time to focus on the areas where perhaps you need the greatest improvement.
Yeah. Do you when you're creating the underpinning, the firm foundation for your story, do you take into account all of the details, or do you leave room where the creative spark can ignite in the writing process as it does sometimes? And
It's
or
funny, the amount of room I leave for the creative spark has diminished steadily. And
really?
yet, there is always discovery during the course of writing. It's inevitable. You can't, I can't think of everything prior to writing a book. And the physical act of moving your characters around, having them interact, going places, you'll always think of new things, often better things than you did in your outline. That's fine. What I have to have beforehand is a really clear understanding of what it is I'm actually trying to write, what the story is, whether that's the type of story or this particular story itself. Is it a coming of age story? If it's a coming of age story, how does coming of age apply to my main character? Where are they starting? Where are they ending? Since you have the Star Wars posters behind you, I'll use that as an example. If we look at the original Star Wars trilogy, you can feel and articulate Luke Skywalker's journey very easily. It's understandable on an instinctual level.
Right.
If I ask you to articulate Rey's journey in the latest trilogy, it's almost impossible because it wasn't cohesive. There are too many writers, too many fingers in the pot.
Right.
There isn't a cohesive vision for what her journey from start to finish is. And so you don't feel it as the audience in the way you can with Luke. So that's what I'm always looking for with an outline. Doesn't matter what type of story it is. I mean, like Fractal Noise is a very different type of story than the ones written before, but I had a very clear idea of what the main character's journey was. And that guided everything. And then that guides your interactions with your side characters, because in a lot of ways, side characters should reflect different aspects of the journey or struggle that your main character is going through.
In talking about your career as a writer, some people will say that if you find that a piece of work that you've created resonates with an audience, that you should stick to what your audience is wanting and plow forward and do that for the rest of your life. And maybe there's a passion project, and when you become successful enough at this, then do your passion projects on the side. But if you're a fantasy author, you are a fantasy author. You had built this amazing career, and then you shifted gears and published this massive science fiction epic.
Yeah.
Were you scared that that the audience wouldn't follow you over, or have you found that uh the diehard fans did follow you and maybe created a portion of a new audience? So what's your experience been with that?
There's a couple parts to that. I mean, the first bit is that I didn't expect To Sleep in a Sea of Stars to sell the way Aragon did. It's a different type of story. It never it never had that broad appeal that, you know, again, the coming of age story like Harry Potter or Aragon or
Yeah.
Hunger Games or Twilight has. So I never expected it to find the same audience. But I was very pleased that it did find the audience it did, and especially
Yeah.
for an adult sci-fi, it sold very well.
And very
And
well received on top of that.
it won Goodreads Best Sci-Fi of the Year, so I'm
Yeah.
happy with that. Um, and Fractal Noise, I mean, got starred review in Publishers Weekly, a bunch of other great reviews from other places. So again, I've been very happy with the result, with the response. Um, so there's all that, and I do think that perhaps at first some science fiction readers, especially the adult ones, kind of looked at perhaps what I was doing a little sideways as like, what's he doing? Nah, come on. He wrote that kid's dragon book. Nah.
Right.
And I think the longer I keep doing this, the more people are gonna go like, oh yeah, he's serious about this genre. He's really giving it an honest attempt, and I'm gonna pick that book up and read it. And hey, I enjoyed it maybe. The other, and then and then the other part of the answer comes from, in the parlance of our era, a place of great privilege, which is that this, in a sense, was a passion project. I didn't need to write it.
Yeah.
I have been very fortunate with the inheritance cycle, so I can just pick and choose my projects as I wish. But I have a lot of stories I want to tell, and a lot of them are in the world of Aragon, which is why we have a new book coming out in November.
Yeah.
But I have that freedom to basically write what I want, and if the readers follow me, great, and if they don't, I'll probably kick myself in the backside and go, "What are you writing?" But I do have that freedom, so that's nice.
Um,
That said, I am a storyteller. I want
yeah.
people to read my books. I'm not. I had a conversation with a very well-known fantasy author who is going to remain unnamed in this conversation, who was lamenting the idea of his books becoming actually more popular than they were, because then they wouldn't be read by this, the true fans anymore. Basically, the dabblers would come in and read his work and just ruin the fan base and all this. I was looking at him going, dude, that is such a elitist attitude. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We write so people will read our stories and hopefully enjoy them. And trying to, firewall them like that, it is just it didn't. I'm a populist in the sense I'm writing books that I hope people will read, and I hope as many people as possible will read them. So
You mentioned Harry Potter a little bit ago, and some of those. You mentioned several franchises that were kind of in the same time frame
mhm,
becoming popular as Aragon did, and my kids were Harry Potter kids. That series was publishing as I had little kids that were growing up,
mm,
and I remember I bought the first Harry Potter book when my oldest son was 2 or 3, I think, and then we
mhm.
started reading them together as he grew up, and then the last book came out. He was in high school, if I remember right. Um, do you find fans that kind of grew up with the Aragon books
Yeah.
and are now mature readers? And how do you feel about your diehard fan base kind of growing up with you?
I mean, I owe them everything. And the thing is, because I started so young, I've grown up with them at the same time. And I'm at the point where I think a lot of authors reach this point much later in their lives because they started publishing later in their lives.
Yeah.
But I'm at the point where, if someone was 16 when Aragon came out, now they're 36, and a lot of times they have kids of their own, um, and they're still reading the books, or they're passing the books on to their kids, or they're naming their kids after some of the characters. So, when Murtagh was announced, I expected a big reaction, but I was actually stunned by the size of the reaction and how many people were like, "This was such a big part of my childhood," and it's like this huge nostalgia hit for a lot of people. And of course, it's just my life, not my own childhood necessarily, but
Yeah.
it was really amazing to see. And I've noticed this for a long time. I mean, even when Inheritance came out, it was already trending in that direction. And now we're 12 years since Inheritance came out, 11 years
Right.
since Inheritance came out. So yeah, and that's why also I want to keep writing in the world of Aragon and not letting such big massive gaps occur,
Yeah.
because I do have a lot of stories there, but I know these readers are there, and it's like I want to tell these stories for them.
When you shift gears from coming off Fractal Noise and
Mm.
then going into Murtag, and you talked a little bit about kind of going back into that world and things coming back to you. Are there certain things that you do to help you switch gears from Christopher the sci-fi author to going back to Alagaësia?
Well, I let myself write longer sentences with fantasy, which sometimes my editor will complain about, but it's a different mode of thinking for me, and it's actually not very hard to switch back because I did the fantasy for so long, and it's such a
Right.
formative age that I mean, there quite literally is probably physical changes in my brain from thinking in these patterns for so long. So it's
Yeah.
it's pretty easy to just slip it on like an old glove or an old shoe. But in some ways, also I have a way of visualizing it that gets me in the mood, which is when I think of the sci-fi. So I'm very visual. I always think of almost like an empty spaceship corridor with artificial gravity, of course. We'll go with artificial gravity, but
Sure.
with like bare metal grating on the floor, and the light in the corridor is this sort of artificial blue light that you see this
Mm.
sort of blue light in a lot of James Cameron's films.
Yes.
And it just, for whatever reason, and I kind of hear, the kind of the background noise of the spaceship, and that just instantly puts me there. That's always kind of the mood I want to be in when I'm writing my sci-fi. And for the fantasy, I mean, I look outside. I live in the Beartooth Mountains here in Montana, so it's every
Yeah,
day
you live in a
inspiration.
fantasy world. Yeah.
Pretty much,
Just
pretty much. It
just
looks
open the
like Lord of the
blinds
Rings
and
outside the window.
it's amazing. Let's talk about Fractal Noise for a minute because To Sleep in a Sea of Stars was this amazing sci-fi epic, in scope and size. Fractal Noise, same world, but we wound the clock back
Hmm.
a couple of decades. What was the after you finished the first book, and I remember you telling me a year or two ago, whenever it was, that I have more stories in this world I want to tell. Is just kind of as soon as I know that people want more of these stories, I
Yeah.
have more to tell. Tell me how Fractal Noise came about and why you decided to turn the clock back and tell this portion of the story.
Well, as you kind of mentioned with the inheritance cycle, once the world was established and the first book was out, the second book comes out a lot faster
Yeah.
because the world building is established. But I actually wrote Fractal Noise all the way back in 2013. So it was the first larger project I wrote after Inheritance, and I wanted to write something that was more adult, a little more serious, um, and in this new setting. So I wrote the first draft of Fractal Noise, and it didn't really work. It didn't really work, and I was looking at it and trying to decide what to do with it, and I decided like that I knew I could fix it. I knew what revisions to make to get it to where I wanted, but I didn't want to put all that effort into it at that point, and I didn't want ultimately Fractal Noise to be the first introduction to the fractal verse for the readers. So I put it aside. I went and worked on To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which took way longer than expected. And then after that was out of my hair, sat down and I reread Fractal Noise, and I could see where I'd sort of gone off the rails. And the time off really did me some good. The changes and revisions I made are not things I could have written, I think, back in 2013. So It is a prequel. It takes place 23 years before To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, but it's a pretty much a standalone novel. You don't need to read To Sleep to read Fractal Noise and vice versa. If you're just getting into the Fractalverse, I might recommend To Sleep first, but I've also seen some early readers who are saying Fractal Noise is a better introduction. It's shorter. It's about 300 pages. Um, it's hard for me to say what people think of it because it's actually
Yeah.
been really split. Some people say it's a fast-paced, thrilling ride, and the next person will say, "Oh man, it just dragged and dragged." So everyone's having a very individual reaction to it, but those who like the book seem to really, really like it, which I'm happy to see. And it tells the story of this survey team that's in a solar system that's being surveyed for potential colonization, and they end up detecting on one of the rocky planets in the system. They end up detecting or discovering this giant hole on the planet. It's like 50 kilometers across, and it's just like a perfect hole. And for various reasons that I won't go into, landing like a drone or something is impractical. So they end up landing a couple of the crew members on foot to go check this thing out. And the book is the story of that expedition. And of course, since we wouldn't have a story otherwise, things do not go particularly well for them.
Of course. Of course. You got a red shirt, some people.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I did about 6 pieces of art for the book as well, which are in both the ebook and the hardcover. So that was a lot of fun.
Nice. Um, I didn't realize that Fractal Noise, that you had come up with this concept before To Sleep. I find that fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, because now we look at this as a follow up to the first book, yet a prequel.
Mhm.
Um, Meaning, and correct me if these are just some assumptions that I'm making, that in your mind the story comes out in a certain order and you tell the story of To Sleep, uh and then this book, so there's a pattern of the way some of the world building is unfolding.
Mhm.
But now that both are out, if someone has not read any of them and they say, well, I'll read the prequel first,
Yeah.
you know and then it's just a straight progression. But when you write it that way, it's not necessarily a straight progression. You
No.
told this story first and then you went back and told this one. Are there things that unfold and unravel in the way you publish them that is going to be a different experience if you read them chronologically?
Uh, well, I mean, for one, the world building I did into Sleep retroactively changed things in Fractal Noise because To Sleep is such a bigger book. By the time I
Yeah.
did all the work on that, I had a much deeper understanding of the setting, and so then that got applied to Fractal Noise and necessitated a certain number of changes. Uh, I mean, there's always been this argument of writing, publishing order versus actual in-world chronological order. I know I've seen, which kind of shocked me that there are box sets of the Chronicles of Narnia, which are ordered chronologically in world, which is absolutely the wrong way to read those stories. By the way, everyone should know this.
1000%.
You need to read them in the published order,
Yes.
which starts with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, of course.
Yes.
So I don't know. It's really hard for me to say because Fractal Noise is so different from To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars it's a space opera. It's a big, sprawling epic with a lot of moving pieces and a lot of characters. And Fractal Noise is much more like a bottle drama. It's more like an account of one of those dire expeditions to the Antarctic that
Right.
folks went through. Um, Personally, I see the connection very clearly because I write about the same sort of set of obsessions in all of my stories. So I can point to this and say it's basically the same story if you look at it from a certain angle. But whether or not the readers will feel that is another question. Um, but this is what I hope to do with the Fractalverse going forward. It's like there are a lot of different types of story that I'm going to be fitting into the Fractalverse. Like one of the next ones I want to write is actually a YA steampunk set on Earth in the Fractalverse.
Oh.
So people are going to go, well, I just read To Sleep and I read Fractal Noise, which was really intense. And now I've got a YA steampunk, like, yeah, or their kid might read that YA steampunk and go, I want to read more in this world. And then we'll see how that works out. But what is not apparent, I think, to the readers right now is actually I'm playing a very long game, which means I have to write fast in order to finish the game. But there's actually a very large thing going on in the Fractal verse that is not become apparent to the readers yet. So I have to
Love
keep
it.
writing.
How do you approach writing YA versus like the adult science fiction? Um, are there certain rules that you abide by for one or the other, or is it just shifting your mindset? Is it keeping the reader in mind? What differentiates these two audiences for you as the writer?
For me, it's just keeping in mind what feels appropriate for who might be reading this. So, uh, you know, if I would feel comfortable telling the story to a 9-year-old, as an example, or older, it depends on what age range,
Yeah.
whether you're going for middle grade or teenager. But basically, would I feel comfortable with a kid of my own of that age reading this story? That's really what guides it. I don't worry too much about um, the emotions being too serious or too mature, because kids have strong emotions and it's okay
Sure.
to acknowledge them. But definitely I wouldn't engage in profanity or sexual content if it's aiming younger. So, but that doesn't seem to impact the power of a story that you can tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think differently in terms of story structure when you're writing
No.
fantasy versus sci-fi, or is it just a difference in window dressing?
Just a difference in window dressing. I mean, when you study structure enough, you start looking at the characters almost like symbols. Like they represent something that the writer is doing. And it almost doesn't matter where the story is set or what the dressing is. I mean, it's been said about Star Wars, for example, you could swap out the lightsabers for regular swords and the
Right.
starships for horses, and you'd need a few other little changes to make it actually work. But Alderaan is a castle, and they're going to burn the castle down with their new siege weapon. There you go. Um, so the trappings almost don't matter, and that's why archetypal stories last so long, because you can slap a new coat of window paint on them, and yet fundamentally they're still the same. Yeah, I think that's pretty much where I've come down to it.
Yeah. Um, what have you seen change in the publishing industry over the last 20 years?
Oh man. I mean, for one, self-publishing is much bigger, and the
Right.
options for self-publishing are, you know,
And you
myriad.
began as a self-published author,
Yeah, well, I mean, so when I
in
started,
in a
ebooks
very
weren't.
different world, but
Yeah,
yeah.
ebooks weren't a thing. There was no iPad, there was no Kindle, there was no Nook. So self-publishing really meant physical copies. Amazon was around, but even then, Amazon shipped you a physical copy. And there
Yeah.
were people who were experimenting with like HTML, PDF books, but there was no standard format or reader that people could use. There were no smartphones. It's not like you could just read on a smartphone. So
Right.
that's been a huge change. The Amazon self-published marketplace has just exploded over the past number of years. Social media, of course, for promotion. I mean, like what we're doing now, and then just in general, the importance of maintaining social media, interacting with fans. I mean, I got into Twitter the day of the book launch for Inheritance in 2011, just when social media was starting to happen, starting to take off. And the difference between then and now, for both for individual authors and then also for the publishers, is staggering. So I haven't launched a big book with Random House since 2011, but I did have my collection of short stories, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, which came out end
Right.
of 2018, beginning of 2019. And Random House did a great job with that. But we all had certain expectations for it, which were not as large as a major entry in the world of Aragon. And the book did just about exactly what we hoped it would do. But the difference even from then to now and how Random House approaches social media marketing, it's night and day. I mean, they are well, I'm not sure how much they'd like me to say because some of it may be proprietary, but they have an entire division devoted to it, and they are deeply engaged in, you know, how people are looking and interacting at advertising posts, hashtags, all sorts of stuff. So that is a big change, and I know they don't do that perhaps for every book. They have limited resources, of course, so they have to pick and choose which books they're really going to focus on. But that's a big one. And another thing is, despite all the dire predictions for the book industry over the years, because of the internet, because of smartphones, more people are reading now than any ever before, and the publishing industry just keeps turning profits,
Yeah.
and more people are getting published as authors. So it's been a good run in terms of publishing. Um, yeah.
One thing that I think took a lot of people by surprise was how COVID affected reading in general
Hmm.
and book sales, because you could still order books online, get them,
Yeah.
shipped to your front door, and a lot of people had a great publishing experience during COVID, and
Yeah.
it was obviously different, and book tours and all of that stuff was different. But have you noticed how that little blip on our cultural radar has shifted things?
I definitely saw that with a number of books that got published that sold very well during the pandemic. I think in terms of my experience, because I launched To Sleep right at the end of
Yeah.
2020, so first year of the pandemic. Um, I think for me, it definitely hurt how the book did because I'm trying to be diplomatic here because on one hand,
Yeah.
the book did very well by any metric, but I'm comparing it to my own past history.
Of course,
So I
which
know
is all you can
which
compare.
is all I can compare it to. So I know
Yeah.
what's possible, and I know that although digital events can be incredibly efficient, you can do something like this and get tens of thousands of views, if not more, without having to leave your home. There is a difference between that and actually doing an in-person event where people come and buy books, and you get a different group of people every
Yeah.
single stop, which you might not get with a digital event. You might get the same people who are just kind of watching your content in general. So
True. True.
um, I know that based off my past experience, that not touring in person for To Sleep really did hurt it. And Tor, to their credit, had this amazing tour and media blitz all lined up. And then as COVID gathered steam, we all had to shift gears. And that was the other thing, is I was one of the first big books there that launched when the publisher was still trying to figure out, how are we going to do this without uh well, I shouldn't say one of the first. There were a couple other big books as well. So, but how do we do this without an in-person tour? I mean, now it's nice because the framework is in place to do both types.
Right.
So there's a lot more of the virtual events like we're doing now, and then I mean, I fly out on Monday to start my tour for Fractal Noise on Tuesday.
Wow. When will the promotion begin for Murtag?
Well, I mean, it's already in stores now. I know they have stuff in Barnes and Noble and elsewhere promoting the book. So it's just going to gather steam throughout the year, and then the tour for Murtag, probably will start November 7th, and I'll be touring the North America. I think I may be going up to Canada, and then I'll also be going over to Europe and possibly elsewhere. Maybe December, January. So busy year.
Speaking of in-person events, I know that you began uh, doing like in-school events, and you dressed up in character.
Yeah.
When Aragon first came out, at what point did you realize, oh crap, I can't do that anymore? Like, this has become an entire thing. That had to be weird when that gear shifted.
Well, I don't actually. That never really happened because I've still done school events here and there. And once Random House picked up Aragon, and then they sent me out on tour, which is something they had never done for first time. They just didn't do for first time
Yeah.
authors back then. And then people were showing up. I mean, and the crowds just got bigger and bigger over the course, to the point where they sent me for a second tour for Aragon. So we did like a week and a half, I want to say, something like that. And then they sent me for a second tour, like in a couple of months, which again they had never done before sending an author out for a second tour. And that's when we really knew, like we've got something here. And then when I toured for Eldest, the second book, that was when the movie was about to come out. It was ramping up. I was filming. I think the movie was actually filming in Budapest at the time. And the crowds were insane. I mean, we're talking like sometimes 4,000 to 6,000 people in a bookstore. I mean, it like I'd be in a Borders or Barnes and Noble, and it's just a sea of heads. Like I couldn't even. I had to stand on tables to like give my presentations. And the funny thing is for me too is, I mean, that really skews your idea of what's normal, right?
Of course.
Especially as a teenager or a young person. But
Yeah.
all of that happened before social media. All the way up to Inheritance. So I've done national television. I've done all of these huge events, and like none of it's on camera. Some of the national stuff, but like none of the events, there's none of it's on social media. So it's like when To Sleep came out and I started doing these virtual events and putting up YouTube stuff, and it was crazy to me how many comments there were from people saying like, I've never seen Christopher. I had no idea what he was. Yeah, I didn't know he was still publishing books, and it was just there was this complete disconnect between the social media generation, if you will, and everyone from my generation that I had been touring with. So that's also been why my team and I have really focused more on social media and just getting more content out there.
That's so wild. Well, Fractal Noise comes out next week. I'm excited for this book to get out into everyone's hands. I know, obviously, you are too, Christopher. And then Murtagh coming out this fall. What are you working on right now between tour and all that?
I am deeply up against the wall with copy editing for Murtagh, because of various life pressures and finishing Fractal Noise at the same time I was editing Murtagh. Things have gotten a little crammed, so I'm actually going to be editing while on book tour for Fractal Noise. So that's what I'm working on. After Murtagh is out of my hair, I'm going to go back to the Fractal verse, and I have a couple of strong projects that I'm passionate about that I want to write next. So perhaps that YA steampunk that I mentioned. And then it's going to be back to the world of Aragon. And I'm just going to, my plan is just to bounce back and forth for the rest of my life if I can.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is Murtagh going to be our last trip there? But
No.
I'm so happy to hear that.
And actually, so for people who don't know, Murtagh is a direct line, full-size sequel to the Inheritance cycle. Aragon's not the main character, but if you've enjoyed the Inheritance cycle, this is you'll want to read this, and it is. People have been asking me like, is it the first book in a new series? What are you doing? And I want to let people read the book before I completely answer that. But it is the first stepping stone in a long line of stepping stones that I'm laying out. So my goal is just. Yeah,
that's the great benefit of building a world as lush and as detailed and inviting as you did with Alagaësia, but because you can then bring in other characters and tell those stories, and that's a testament to how well you did and creating a place people want to go.
I've been teasing the long fabled book 5 in the world of Aragon for a long time, and I have to be honest, Murtagh is not book 5. It is. I was starting to work on book 5 and work, doing the foundational work I've been talking about, and I realized that too much had to be established before I got into book 5. So book 5 is now book 6. So Murtagh is I don't want to say it's an unplanned book, but it's a new. I pushed open some space for Murtagh to fit in.
I love it. Fractal Noise, go grab it next week. Go ahead and pre-order Murtagh, or
and the illustrated edition.
Just products coming out everywhere.
Right. Just get them all.
Just get them all. Good.
Take out a new mortgage. Just have a Paolini shelf.
A shelf room. Yeah. Christopher, always a pleasure getting to catch up.
Same.
We're going to send everyone to pick up their copies of Fractal Noise and Murtag. Thank you, as always, for taking time to come on the show.
My pleasure. We'll have to do it again soon.